Okay, should I launch into my diatribe?
Yes, if that's possible.
Okay. With colleagues, including Simon Bartlett, who was Queensland's transmission engineer for many decades, we have gone through and reviewed the Victorian government's and the Australian Energy Market Operator's electricity transmission plan for many years now. We've critiqued it from many angles, and we've made our views known to communities and to the government and to AusNet and subsequently to VicGrid at the time that it was formed and since. Our main objection to the government's now policy, which was formed in the Energy Market Operator's plan, is the 500 kilovolt VNI West transmission line from Victoria, carving an enormous arc through Victoria, through your territory, and into our neighbour. There's no good reason in energy economics for that transmission line. The argument put forward from the market operator is to share capacity between New South Wales and Victoria, but the capacity to be shared is wind and solar produces at almost exactly the same time for almost all of the year, almost all days of the year, and the wind generation is very correlated between the two states. And we can store electricity just as cheaply in New South Wales as we can in Victoria. So the transmission line lacks plausible rationale in energy economics. We've put this to the market operator and they have failed to address our concerns in any plausible way. In addition, they've grossly understated the cost of the transmission line, and in its planning had absolutely no idea of the land use impacts, which are now quite evident as seen in the major opposition to the transmission line all the way along its length. So we don't believe there's any good reason for a 500 kilovolt, which is a 85 a line with typically a 100-meter easement and stands up to 85 meters high and has a major impact on the environment locally. We don't think there's a good reason for that. We put forward an alternative electricity transmission plan called Plan B, which we published in 2004. The essence of that transmission plan was to meet the government's clean energy targets by utilising the existing easements and the existing transmission lines in the main and upgrading that capacity. And we calculated that that would create across the state as much hosting capacity as the Victorian government said it needed to meet its targets. It also put more of that capacity in the southwest and the southeast of the state, where the existing transmission capacity is much stronger than it is in the central, northwest, and north central areas of the state. The Victorian government ostensibly independently reviewed that plan. It was not an independent review. We had no sight of the consultant's terms of reference. The consultant answered to the government privately, not to us. We did not find the report credible. So as far as we are concerned, the engineering economics of our plan stands up, and we know it will have a much lower land use impact than the plan that the Victorian government is now pursuing. What does that plan mean for your region? It does mean some expansion of wind and solar capacity, but not much relative to existing capacity. Most of the new capacity will be situated, as I said, in the southeast and southwest of the state, where the wind resources are comparable, if not better, and land use impacts are much lower and relatively easier to accommodate on land with herds than it is on cropping land. That's the essence of our report. If you wish to find more detail on our report and the many different opinion articles and studies and responses that we've written, You can find them on our website, vepc.org.au, and I'm happy to share a link separately to the relevant subdirectory, but you can easily find it there. I've been asked to address a couple of other comments. The second area that I haven't discussed is demand growth for electricity in Victoria. Victoria's electrical demand has been steadily declining. Per capita, it's declined more than any other region or as a national average country in the OECD, largely because Victoria is deindustrializing and much cheaper or much ways of actually using electricity that use much less electricity for the output, such as LED lights, better fridges and TVs, are decreasing per capita output. However, the population of Victoria, most notably in Melbourne, is expanding quickly. And so in aggregate terms, it is declining, but not as quickly as per capita. There's lots of discussion in electricity circles as to whether AI and server and other growth will change the trajectory of electricity growth in Victoria. We have yet to see that. I'm not certain. I'm pretty skeptical that there will be a major increase in load from those demand sources in Victoria, simply because we do not have the supply. And the coal-fired generators that we have cannot be run any harder than they are to accommodate that supply. And absent expansion, such as the Victorian government has been seeking, it's difficult to see how Victoria will meet growing demand, leave alone be able to achieve the energy transition that the government has in mind, which is struggling, particularly since the government has put forward an implausible transmission expansion plan. A third area I'll talk about is, and this is not often discussed in the media yet, is the electricity price impacts of the Victorian government's plan. The existing regulatory asset value of transmission assets in Victoria is $3.9 billion. The plan that the government has set out, we estimate, will increase that by a factor of 8 in the next 10 years, which, if left to be paid for by electricity consumers, as the government intends, will make electricity unaffordable to the community. So, in essence, on every substantive measure, we do not think the government has put forward a plausible plan. We're very doubtful that the property rights changes the Victorian government is envisaging, giving them the right to access farmholders' land without consent, is going to change the debate. We think, if anything, it will simply cause a greater blockage for the government. So we think the government needs to go back to the drawing board. We think there's an urgent need for a credible transmission policy. We're not convinced that there's, as I said, a plausible argument in the energy economics, and it's perfectly obvious to all of you, as it is to many in the city, that the government has failed to adequately account for the land use impacts of its policy. So that's where we've got to. I'll be more than happy to discuss any aspect of that further that you would like me to focus on, or indeed to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, I guess I'd be interested to know why the government's not listening to what you're saying.
I think the government locked themselves in 5-6 years ago in taking the advice of the energy bodies. It failed to have independent regard to that advice. I think it feels that it's tied itself down and it can't now change. I think perhaps some in the government feel, and I'm really not certain that this is a feeling across all members of the government, but I think some in the government feel that to relent now is to give in, rather than to see adaptation at this point being a change that will allow them to achieve their policy objectives in a way that the community finds suitable. So I think things have got to an impasse. Of course, we're frustrated that the government hasn't had better regard to the evidence, and we'll continue to hold our line as long as plausible evidence on the energy economics, which is our expertise, can find that our advice is not well formed.
Right. Well, that seems a little foolhardy of government to pursue that line when there's strong evidence to the contrary.
Yes, we think so. As I say, the government saw itself as independent from a lot of the transmission plan before it formed VicGrid. I think it could have said it was being advised at that point, but now it's formed VicGrid and it's endorsed the substance of the problematic aspects of the transmission plan. VicGrid have put forward other plausible changes, and we speak highly of those. Those are plausible. Those are essentially taking large parts of our Plan B. But the big failure, VNI West and the Western Renewables Link, the two are two parts of the one single transmission line. The government's now owned. It's taken the advice from EMO and it now owns it. So we can blame EMO as the origin of the advice, but the buck now stops with the government. And it is frustrating that they are failing to adjust.
Right. Are there any questions from the floor? We've got someone with some real experience. Robert, if you want to ask a question, why don't you come up here? Come up here. You're going to need to have a look in here, and you can ask the question to Bruce there.
Is there any scope in the future that actually...
You should say who you are.
I'm Robert Payne. I'm a vice chair of this organisation. Is there any possibility in the future that actually, if we can get nuclear accepted, that we can actually see some sort of sensible power industry?
The path to nuclear power will be a long one. There's legislative change at a federal and a state level. Then there's technology selection, siting, approvals, funding, and so on. Nuclear is a plausible electricity generation technology. It's used in many countries of the world. Many of those countries that have it are expanding it. And some of those that don't yet have it are investing in it. But Australia is very far from it. Unfortunately, our track record in large capital projects is abysmal. We as a country show ourselves, other than in iron ore and a few other private sector, large capital sectors, show ourselves to be hopeless developers of large capital infrastructure. So in the time frame that the coal-fired generators have to run before they fall over and expire, I think it's very difficult to imagine that nuclear will be able to take their place. However, I've long argued that it's a silly policy to ban nuclear. We should leave the doors open, and we should seek to learn seek to learn from every opportunity from nuclear as fast as we can. But we haven't done that, and that's where we are now.
Okay, so keep all options open is a good idea, I reckon. But any other questions from the floor? What about the VNI West line and the Western Renewable line? Has anyone got any questions in relation to how much it costs or why the government's pursuing them?
I was going to ask.
Well, yeah.
Bruce, I was going to ask if you could explain, you mentioned some land use issues that the government haven't taken into account. Would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
Yes, I think the government and EMO in particular at the time that they were planning these transmission lines, and dare I say since, had essentially no meaningful regard to local knowledge and local factors in selecting transmission expansion plans. The way they adjusted for land use constraints was blunt. They quite clearly had a policy objective to approve VNI West, and they simply didn't have regard to the local environmental and land use impacts of their transmission line. It was perfectly obvious what these were. As the moment the community got sight of the government's proposals, there was enormous outcry, and long has been with the first link of the VNI West into Western Victoria. EMO's transmission planning has been driven by electrical engineering optimization, often driven by where EMO thought the highest yield wind or solar generation was. The differences in the yield in different parts of the country and different parts of the state are minor. These are simply not big decision variables. The big decision variables are access to transmission and land use impacts. And those simply did not feature effectively in the transmission expansion or generation expansion plans set forward by the energy market operator. So it's failed to have regard to communities in a plausible assessment of benefits and costs, and failed to have regard to the wonderful asset that Victoria already has in a massively heavy, strong transmission corridor to the southeast of the state, and land use impacts on beef country, which relative to cropping country are much lower for wind turbine generation.
All right, I'm looking for some more questions. Anyone got any thoughts? What I'm really interested in, Bruce, is how much loss in transmitting power 350 kilometres back to Melbourne from areas like the Wimmera.
So losses will vary based at the margin and based on the average. At the margin, the marginal loss, so the incremental loss of electricity will vary depending on the loading of the transmission line and the location of demand and generation in the state. Marginal losses can be 20%. So 1/5 of every unit generated doesn't reach the dominant load centre in Victoria at the margin. Average losses on a 500 kV line, which is a very high voltage line and would have relatively low losses for the same capacity than a low voltage line, might be 5 to 7%. But those marginal loss factors can greatly affect generation location and can affect the viability of generators in those regions. And we see that already when transmission lines become constrained, marginal loss factors rise to very high levels, and wind farm operators get much less compensation than they had in mind. Those losses to generation and demand matter, but what matters even more in a cost sense, frankly, is the capital outlays, which are very big for a 500 kV line, most particularly when they're very long distance, and land use impacts, which are not meaningfully formally costed in the transmission expansion plans that have been developed. And we can see those land use impacts are very significant through the opposition that groups like yours and others have been putting to the government.
So the question is then why hasn't the government adequately taken those costings into account, like the land use change and the impacts on other people and other industries?
As I say, the government locked themselves in, and somewhere between that lock-in and the feeling that to change at this point would be too difficult for them, perhaps a loss of face for some of those involved. They have manifestly failed to do that. The opportunity in Victoria, as in much of the rest of Australia, is to utilise existing infrastructure, to upgrade it as far as possible, to put on bigger conductors on existing towers, in some cases to add additional circuits to towers or build adjacent towers next to existing towers to utilize existing easements. Those are the opportunities, and the government has failed to adequately capitalize on them. I think, in addition, it might well be the case that federal, state factors are affecting transmission expansion policy in the states. Victoria is going to need to rely on the Australian government very heavily to fund the energy transition for transmission, for offshore wind, for the subsidy of wind and solar production. And perhaps the Victorian government feels that were they to vary their plan, they might be concerned that the federal government will undermine or decrease the subsidy that they would otherwise pay. I can't be sure that that's the case, but there is a very high dependency of the state on the federation, and that might well be a factor that is affecting the ability of the government to adjust to the information as is now clear.
So there were some changes to the offshore generation. I think some of the projects there have been removed or withdrawn.
There are some proponents of offshore wind farms who have now pulled out. There are still many left vying for competition for government support for their farms. But it's now evident that those offshore wind farms are going to require far more subsidy than the government had anticipated when they set their policy many years ago now, because the relative cost of offshore wind has expanded much more than battery and solar. And so, again, that element of the Victorian government policy will depend very heavily on the federal government.
Okay, and the only other thing I guess that I'd be very interested in is they're replacing a lot of baseload energy with renewable, which is solar driven or wind driven. What's your view of the stability of a system that's driven by renewable energy?
Yeah, moving away from a stored fuel resource, which is what coal and gas less so than coal, because you can't easily store large amounts of it in gas, but you can nonetheless store lots of coal and gas by storing coal in piles before it gets into the generators, is a technology we know and understand. It is also inflexible in some ways in its operation. Coal-fired generators are enormous thermal machines, and they need to be operated within tight boundaries. Shift to a variable resource like wind and solar definitely brings new challenges. You can diversify some of that variability through a combination of wind and solar, and you need to add a great deal of storage once your renewable penetration reaches very high levels. And you can see this in the dispatch of wind and solar on the electrical systems. It's data that I look at frequently. For many parts of the day and many days of the year and seasons, most notably in autumn and spring during the day, the wind and the sun can meet much of the electricity that we consume, but there are many days in winter and some days in autumn and in peak summer when we simply do not have the combination of the two. So you quite clearly, as you shift to a clean energy system, need to add storage. There are also other elements of the electrical system, what's known as system strength, which is the ability of the system to have enough current at different points in the power system to be stable. Those need to be added in either batteries which are able to provide that service or synchronous devices. There are engineering challenges that are involved in all aspects of the transition. I think many of those are manageable. They add cost, but they're manageable until the wind and solar penetration as a proportion of the energy mix reaches very high levels, at which point, if you're to have a system based on clean energy only, you need an enormous amount of storage, such that that would not be economically viable at this point. I don't think the energy transition challenges we face on the engineering side related to variability of wind and solar are a major obstacle yet. they will be a major obstacle when wind and solar reach very high proportions. Our major obstacle now is transmission expansion and land use implications associated with that, and building wind and solar in communities that don't welcome it. Different communities have different views on it. Some are more willing to make the trade-offs and compromises and obtain income from that than others. And that needs to be brought into the energy transition mix in a way that it hasn't. The shift in policy needs to be one from top-down control, an inflexible response to new information, to one that seeks agreement and settlement with communities and acceptance of those. And for that, communities need to be brought into the picture, not as parties to be consulted, but as parties to be agreed with in settlements. And those are the major directions that we're pushing for the government to find agreement with local communities to achieve a transition that's in the interests of the whole community.
So in Queensland and New South Wales, they've got a policy, or they've introduced a policy of community consultation and transparency. Do you think Victoria will follow that same pathway?
I think many in the government will claim that they have followed that. In fact, I've heard many times the authorities say that they've done that. I think a meaningful process is not just consultation, not just we've asked them and they said no and we'll find an agreement or we'll impose, but a genuine negotiated settlement, one where the community are decision makers, or not the only decision makers, but are parties to an agreement, where they and the government and the transmission entities and the renewable developers can come together and nut out an agreement, or if they can't find agreement, to go back to the government and say, this community has not found it possible to find a compromise that meets the clean energy objectives of the government in this area. I think that brought on as genuine parties to an agreement, one that involves better siting of transmission lines, different transmission line design, perhaps a much greater concentration on rooftop solar in Melbourne and Geelong and the urban areas where there's enormous untapped potential, and siting wind and solar generation in those communities or those parts of the state that are happy with it, is where a negotiated settlement process must head. But for that to happen, the community need to be brought on as parties to an agreement, not just consultation. And I'm strongly encouraging not just the government, but the affected communities to be seeking exactly that sort of arrangement in their discussions with the government and with the transmission entities, so that parties might come around the table and seek agreement and seek compromises. And if they can't find compromises and agreement, then they say so.
Well, there's been two very good examples where country councils have decided, well, maybe even more, where country councils have decided that not to support particularly the transmission. In Northern Grampians, they've taken a position opposing the Western Renewable Link and the VNI West line. The Yarriambiack Shire Council here has a policy on transmission and renewable energy, which is picked up two of our key policies, which is that the buffer zone be included on host land, and that the right of anyone to appeal the decisions in VCAT be reinstated. And they're two, like justice for everyone. And I think they're two very good, very supportive councils on trying to get around some logical renewable builds when we've got a government pushing solely down a pathway of we're pushing on regardless of what anyone thinks.
Yeah, that sort of process sounds exactly the sort of process that is useful. And the government and the transmission entities should be brought to the table And if they find they can't find a compromise in keeping with that, then they need to drop the plans or find alternative plans. I think I should stress here, there's no single silver bullet. There are so many decision variables in the energy transition that encompass shifting demand, building generation much closer to the point of use, expanding existing transmission capacity versus new capacity, the choice and type of wind and solar generation, the extent of co-location of storage, and any one of those variables can make a major difference. And brought together, you can have a plausible energy transition that looks very different to the one that the energy market operator claims is the only one or is the best one.
Then how do we get government to agree to that?
My advice is stand your ground reasonably, put forward your objections reasonably. I've been seeking to do that. I haven't had much success, to be perfectly honest, but it's the only way I know. Have well-founded objections and put them forward, to the parties reasonably. I dare say, given the temperature of the issues, things might well escalate, and there may well be some really meaningful conflict, which is to be regretted if it gets to that. Every opportunity to avoid that on both parties would be extremely important. For mine, I don't see a reason to vary the advice we've set out. We have not had a plausible response, and so we stick to our guns and hope that reason ultimately is going to prevail and cool heads will find suitable compromises.
Well, certainly there's areas further south that are absolutely, the transmission lines aren't going to occur, and we're going to fight them at the gate. We're going to fight them on the land. It's just not going to happen. But I've got a text message, and anyone from the audience can text me a question. So that was very smart. Thank you, Flossie. No, it wasn't Flossie. Do you think we can stop these transmission lines from going ahead? Do you think it's entirely possible that farmers can prevent them from being constructed?
VNI West, certainly. Certainly, I can't see why not. No one's struck ground on this. There's no pylons to be pulled up. AusNet apparently has a contract for the first section. They'll be looking for transmission work in Victoria, and there's plenty to do other than VNI West. And I'm sure a commercial agreement can be found where they'll find work in other projects. So I don't think on the basis of sunk cost or any other reason, these transmission lines are unstoppable. If anything, I believe the government is far more likely to find success in its own energy transition objectives, which after all is its major policy objective in keeping the lights on, the sooner it drops these lines. So I think it's in the public interest, even from the government's policy point of view, that that they drop it. I think there's every reason for them not to have. Oh, there's every good reason for them never to have been put on the table, and I can see no good reason why they should be forced on now.
Right. Okay. Well, that's an extremely positive outcome, because if those transmission lines aren't completed, particularly the Western Renewable link in the VNI West, these projects up in the Wimmera Mallee will be high and dry with hosts with caveats that will be never built, and the wind developments won't occur.
Yes, so I can't comment on any particular projects. I'm not close enough to the commercial agreements that have been struck between various parties. But I can say that the transmission line itself, the VNI West line, is simply not needed for the energy transition, and the sooner the government gives up on it, the easier and quicker will be the energy transition sort.
All right, excellent. Well, now I've got 3 questions coming in. That's great. What are the restrictions travelling under these high voltage lines? Because there's some talk that 3 metre maximum height to transit under these high voltage lines that they're building. Do you know anything about that, Bruce?
No, I don't, and it will vary based on the land shape between the towers, the minimum clearance of the land and the land shape. I think it'll vary by the type of equipment that's moving underneath. It's all around the gap between the transmission line and the electrical parts of a moving device, which can cause a flashover and an arc. I'm afraid I don't know those particular transmission details, so can't comment on that.
All right, thank you. Another question is, why can't we build a new coal generator? Yeah, why can't Australia build a new one?
It can plausibly build new coal generators. The difficulty is it's very expensive to build it. They'll take a long time to build, and it'll have to be built with government's money. Trying to get private investors into coal in Victoria or elsewhere will be impossible. And relative to the energy delivered, even after you've added the costs of building new transmission lines, upgrading transmission lines, and building storage, solar in particular is just so much cheaper that the delivered cost of energy will be lower. So there is no restriction on, at least in terms of hard policy of building new coal. There's no ban on it, but commercially it's impossible.
Right, okay, that's interesting. So when I think about all that, building new solar production in Melbourne, close to where it's being used, the only challenge then is the storage of energy, how we store that energy for use at the time it's demanded.
Yes, we put out a policy paper in August last year, which had a very detailed look at battery-backed solar on business premises. So this is warehouses, shopping centres, large parking lots, factories, and so on. And we believe not much policy support is needed for battery-backed solar. It wouldn't necessarily store enough electricity to meet 100% across the year, but you can store sufficient amount to shift a whole lot of the production from the time of solar production into the evening peak, and so massively reduce the demand for distant wind and solar. Since we wrote that report, battery costs have continued to decline, as have solar. And commercially now there's a lot of battery-backed solar happening on factory roofs and elsewhere. That policy can be turbocharged inexpensively to the community through government support that will be very much cheaper than large-scale generation policy support, and of course puts the production right at the point of use, utilizes the medium voltage distribution networks, which are enormously strong elements of our electrical infrastructure, and of course enormously take pressure off landholders. We've recommended that as a major focus for government policy. I think they're getting there, but very slowly. Frankly, they should exhaust that opportunity long before they put major impositions on rural communities for distant wind and solar production.
All right, thank you. And one last question, if any questions from the floor? There's one more being texted to me, which is how long before Australia becomes like Spain with an unreliable energy system that drops out with the current policy by government is continuing?
Yeah, the Spanish faults, there were many and no strong consensus yet on quite what the combination was of the responsiveness of coal and nuclear generators and the responsiveness of the solar generators that tripped off the system. So quite what the Spanish situation was is not clear. Australia, certainly South Australia, has been at this point before. It has strong interconnection to Victoria, which helps massively. I think the New South Wales and Victorian electricity networks, power systems are in a pretty precarious position. The coal generation that we have available is struggling, some of it to keep going in both New South Wales and Victoria. And VNI West, we've objected to through the single point of failure being such a major transmission line, according to the Australian Energy Market Operator and the Victorian government, heavily operated all the time. All we need is one of the weather events that have knocked out major transmission lines in Victoria repeatedly to knock out that transmission line to find very major power faults in the whole of Victoria. So it's, to us, grist to the mill of avoiding exactly those sorts of weather events that impacted Spain and have indeed impacted South Australia and Victoria. And in our context of ever weaker coal plant, which is now, at least in some cases, very well past its use by date. So yeah, we're in the midst of a stuttering and problematic energy transition.
Right. So it seems to me that energy storage is the key. So is there any new energy storage technology? Like we've got pumped hydro, we've got batteries, but where's the energy storage coming from? And the government's sort of been relying on hydrogen to use the surplus during the day and feed it out when required. But
yeah, so the main storage that Australia has and long has had is in its hydro. Testing.
Yep. Carry on. Yep.
The main source of electrical storage that Australia has.
We're just going to change the batteries and that.
Okay, no problem.
It's very heavily energy reliant.
There we go.
We need to find another power source.
Other way around. Yep. Other way. Oh, yeah, they're both the same way.
Technology. Bruce.
No problem.
Ooh. That's interesting one. That's that. Oh no, that doesn't look good.
Leave it. No, okay, just press the button.
Testing. Testing.
It's really gone a little pear-shaped now.
Yeah, we do apologise. I
Okay.
never liked this microphone, and it can actually go.
Have
That's
to
okay.
invest in a new one.
Gee, that's interesting.
I don't think we'll go repair that.
Can you hear me? No, can't. They go the other way around.
Negative, positive.
Blind's leading the blind here.
We'll give it one last go, Bruce, and otherwise we're probably not going to.
Yep, there you go.
There we go. We got it going. Couldn't believe it.
Australia's electrical system is its main storage now is hydro. lithium-ion is now a competing technology that's commercially viable. It's growing quickly in Australia, as it is in Europe and the US. It's now in California in particular and Texas, a plausible, very large source of electricity storage every day in moving production from the middle of the day into the evening. We've had battery storage growing quickly in Australia too. So far, its main application has been short duration use to meet very brief peaks or very brief needs. But as it expands, it'll come quickly to rival the capacity of hydro. Pumped hydro is spoken about frequently, but it's expensive to develop, takes a long time. And as we all know from Snowy 2, we're making a complete hash of trying to develop it cost effectively. So I think lithium-ion battery storage will continue to go gangbusters. Costs are declining, and it'll be a very significant source of electricity storage in our power systems and important enabler for the transition. Most usefully, it can be put right at the point of use. It's not a big deal to put enough storage on business and household premises to store as much electricity as they could possibly need. So it's one of those wonderful technologies that comes in factory-made devices that are plug and play and can be moved from one location to the other and put at the point of use. So this greatly expands the capability to situate solar electricity in particular on the customer's premises, and so decreases the need for remote large-scale transmission expansion in order to connect remote large-scale wind and solar farms.
So I think up here in the Wimmera Valley, they're deciding to build very large-scale industrial batteries, or there's plans for those. What's the life of those batteries, and is it a sensible location to put these battery storage? Surely you'd put it where you use the energy, not where it's produced.
Yes, I think a lot of the storage will go in both places, where it's produced, if it's produced from wind or solar, and where it's consumed. Much more will go, I think, close to where it's consumed. The case for putting it where it's produced, if it's from wind or solar, is it allows you to much better utilize the transmission capacity. Instead of having the capacity size to meet the variable wind and solar, if you can decrease effectively the generation fed into the grid by feeding it into a battery and later taking it from the battery into the grid, you can get much better utilization of the transmission grid. And getting better utilization means per unit of electricity shifted, you need less transmission capacity. So it'll end up going in both. I think by and large, the remote location of battery storage by and large is not going to be a big deal. Relatively, the land footprint is not huge, and it decreases transmission impacts on local communities, and so is I think something that will naturally happen, not least because the wind and solar producers don't want their production to be held hostage to the variable market and a transmission line which is clogged up at the time that the wind is blowing or the sun is shining.
Yeah, so batteries are an essential add-on to a wind or renewable development. What about the Japanese? I've got a question here, and this will be probably the last one, if that's okay. What about the batteries the Japanese have developed that are more stable than lithium-ion batteries for storage, energy storage?
So there's a whole bunch of battery technologies competing. Lithium-ion is by far the dominant. There's lithium, cobalt, and manganese, which are different minerals used in the anode that have different power densities. Not cost effective for stationary storage, but utilized in electric vehicles because their power to weight density is better. There are flow batteries, as they are known, lead iron, which is long established, steel batteries or iron batteries, which rust over time and can be restored. Those are more stable, but they are not terribly cost effective relative to lithium ion, which is a much easier technology to operate and can be built in factories. I don't think the Japanese are battery leaders anymore. They did once have a lead in batteries, but it's now globally the Chinese are by far the technology leaders in terms of leading edge technology and builders of batteries, although gigafactories, as they're called, large battery factories, are pinging up everywhere in the world now. Lithium ion is now a very stable, well-known technology. As long as you don't damage it in its operation and charging, the flammability and other risks can be well managed. And so I don't think there's anything to be fearful of them. I think they are a plausible storage technology.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. And given there's no more text message questions, which has been great, and you've been on for nearly an hour, I guess I'm going to draw it to a close. And what I'd love for Tracy to show the audience, can you turn that around to show the audience to Bruce, if that's possible? And then at least you'll see who you've been talking to, and all smile. And I think you should all applaud and thank Bruce for his great work.
The background's blurred.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. And I guess I'll just summarise just quickly. The plan that the government's adopted, I think, is in Bruce's mind not the most adequate plan. And the building of large transmission lines incurs some degree of loss. And the government's not listening to any alternative views. They've got it in their mind. They want to produce a certain outcome and are prepared to run over rural communities. And it's quite likely that rural communities will be able to have a voice. So as long as we stick together, we can actually achieve a result. Community consultation is important going forward. So thank you very much, Bruce, for your work and effort.
Super. Thank you.